Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and this episode is a solo episode. We're flying alone today, and we're going to be discussing the idea of inclusivity, why historically, people have been excluded from many parts of society for reasons beyond their control, their sex, their religion, their gender, their age, their race, and how societies become more inclusive over time. And that is generally a good thing, but perhaps not universally. I want to talk about the idea that in some situations, we have actually maxed out on inclusivity in a way that is detrimental to the very things that we care about, the outcomes that we're trying to gain. But before we jump into the actual episode, I want to say first, thank you for listening. If you are a supporter of the podcast, if you are a member of the Center for New Liberalism, thank you. You are what makes the podcast and our entire project possible. If you're not a supporter, now is a great time to jump in. We have our New Liberal Action Summit coming up this summer. We're excited to invite a bunch of you there. Members get first dibs on access. It's a very cool conference. We'd love to see you there. Applications are open now. And there's a lot of other benefits to joining the Center for New Liberalism. You can keep in touch with the work that we're doing. You can join a local chapter and get involved in local politics in your city. You can obviously make sure that you never miss an episode of the podcast, that you get some cool swag. And it helps support the mission and the work that we do. You can join by going to cnliberalism.org/become a member. Thank you so much for your support. Now let's jump into the episode. All right, so to start this off, there's an episode that I want to talk about, kind of a series of incidents and discourses and discussions that took place on social media last week. And I thought, on the one hand, they're just very deeply silly. It's kind of easy to make fun of this kind of thing. But as is so often the case, there's actually something we can learn from ridiculous online discussions beneath the surface. I would say about every 6 months or so, the same argument happens on progressive-leaning social media spaces, whether, you want to talk about, I don't know, this happens on Blue Sky, it happens on Twitter, it happens on Tumblr sometimes. But it's like a never-ending argument. It pops up, people argue about it, and then it comes back again. Generally, the way this starts is that a story will circulate of someone behaving in a deeply antisocial way in public. And maybe there's just a story, maybe it's text-based. Oftentimes there's a video, but someone will be, maybe smoking meth on a train or masturbating on a public bus, right? Or just doing something crazy. And a fight will break out about the correct response to such behavior. One of the most famous examples of this was a few years back when there was literally a fight about whether or not someone should be worried that there was someone smoking meth on their subway train. And shockingly, while most people were normal and said, that doesn't seem good, we shouldn't allow that, some people had the point of view, he's not hurting you. This guy's just smoking his meth in peace. Why don't you leave him be? Why are you so, discriminatory, I guess, towards the homeless, which I think they're just assuming this guy is homeless. It's hard enough to be an addicted homeless person. He doesn't need you yelling at him as well. That was a pretty famous instance of the discourse from a few years back. Last week, a user on Twitter posted about someone who urinated in the middle of a crowded subway train. And a lot of times this comes down to public transit, behavior on public transit. Some commentators obviously expressed disgust at this idea and, demanded stricter policing of public indecency. We need to clamp down on these things. But other people made fun of the complaints. They called those people who were upset reactionaries and racist and classist. The phrase, which is a great phrase, carceral saneism, got thrown around. This is an example of what I and many other academics like to call carceral saneism. It's a feature of late stage capitalism, and it's how we oppress the homeless and the mentally ill. People were told, oh no, someone peed in front of you. Why don't you just toughen up? Is that the worst thing that happened to you today? Oh no, you poor baby. And basically there were people deflecting from the pretty basic idea that urinating in the middle of a crowded subway train is a bad thing to do. It's probably an unacceptable thing to do. I don't even know why I said probably. It just is. That doesn't seem controversial to me, but on social media, you can find any number of crazy people. Now, this may seem like, an isolated episode of just ridiculous people arguing about ridiculous circumstances. But I do think that there's something important at the heart of what's happening here. It's not happening for no reason. It's not an argument that springs from nowhere. There's an idea that I think has become very, very important in progressive and left-leaning circles that I think is worth pushing back against. And that idea is inclusivity, and specifically over-inclusivity. So what do we mean by that? Society, I would say, over the past few generations, has become remarkably more inclusive than it used to be, right? And this has largely been a good thing. If you go back 100 years ago, women were excluded from so many parts of society that it would be hard to list them all. The same thing is true of, at least in American context, anyone who wasn't white, any race other than white got you excluded from all sorts of institutions, from public life in many ways, from private businesses. And you can go on and on. You can talk about exclusion based on sexuality and gender, based on disability, based on any number of factors. And that has decreased over time. Certainly, we are not in a perfect position where sexism and racism and all these things have been perfectly eradicated, but we are in a much better place than we used to be. And, discrimination has become less and less acceptable over time. Barriers for these marginalized groups have crumbled for the most part. And I think this is largely a good thing. It would be very hard to argue that the decline of racism and sexism has been anything but excellent and good for society overall. But along the way, we became fairly obsessive at some point about never excluding anyone, about inclusion not as a means, but as the end itself. And at some point, we failed to realize that over-inclusivity might carry its own harms. What do we mean by over-inclusivity? Again, it's the instinct that no one should ever be excluded from any space, from any institution, for any reason. And that exclusions, by their nature, are wrong. Not just in general or in most cases, but overall without question. And people will rarely say it like this, but you can see the logic and how they actually behave and in the arguments they make. It's the silent, unstated assumption behind some of these ridiculous fights. In our public transit systems, It's not enough for some people to demand compassion and inclusion towards homeless people. They demand maximum compassion and inclusion towards homeless people, even when those homeless people are acting in disruptive, antisocial ways. The fact is that antisocial behavior ruins public spaces for everyone. If our buses and subway cars and trains are riddled with people who are openly using drugs, urinating, defecating, engaging in lewd behavior, experiencing untreated mental illness, acting in violent ways, if that's happening, those spaces become unusable for other people, for the majority of people. And this is not just a problem that happens on public transit. This is something you see in public libraries, sadly. Libraries in many cities have become de facto homeless shelters where dozens of homeless people will simply hang out all day and act disruptively and make it incredibly difficult for regular patrons to enjoy and use the library. It scares away other citizens. Some school districts have grown so reluctant to fail students that they pass them along, even though they can't meet educational benchmarks. And again, they don't say explicitly, no one should ever be excluded from anything, ever. But they act as though in our school systems, it would be bigoted or somehow wrong to fail any student. You can see this in, frankly, little things that don't matter quite so much, but that the logic is the same. You can see it in the rise of mysteriously incapable service animals. Again, there's a general instinct towards inclusion that perhaps makes sense, that some people, the blind, the severely mentally ill or depressed or anxious, might need a service animal to accompany them in some spaces. And especially if that service animal is trained in a professional way, that seems great. You know, I don't want to stop a blind person from entering a public space because they need their guide dog. But we've all seen, I think, that the amount of service animals has somehow exploded to 20 or 30 or 40 times what it used to be. And I don't think we have 20 to 30 to 40 times as many blind people as we used to. What we have is people who abuse the service animal idea because they'd like to bring their pet with them. And in the name of not excluding or questioning anyone, we kind of have just allowed this to happen. Is it a big deal? It's not a huge deal. It's not the thing that's going to, take down society, but it's yet another instance of this. Another kind of silly example of this, again, not high stakes, but just to continue to illustrate the point, there's this ever increasing length that gets applied to the LGBT label. I've always called people in the gay community, the broader community, LGBT. It's the term that I grew up with, and to me it seems to be a fairly comprehensive term. But some people have tried to use other longer terms, and while there's nothing wrong with that, I don't think, nobody's being necessarily hurt. We went from the gay community way back in the day to LGBT, to LGBTQ, to LGBTQIA, to LGBTQIA plus, I believe, LGBTQIA2S plus, and there may even be other ones beyond that. Frankly, I don't know that I'm woke enough to know anything longer than LGBTQIA2S plus. It starts to become a memory problem to actually remember all the letters in order without having to look it up. And look, is anybody being hurt by this? Is this consequential in any way? No. But you will sometimes see people asking you to use the IA2S Plus version. And it makes me wonder, how many Two-Spirit people even exist in the United States? Two-Spirit is a Native American designation of people who feel like they are not one gender or the other. It was not a term that even existed prior to 1990. I think the large majority of Native American tribes did not have this concept in their original, conceptions of the world, but some of them did. And if someone wants to identify as Two-Spirit, that seems fine. But the question remains, is it enough to say LGBT or LGBTQ, or do we need to explicitly include every possible additional form of identity? Do we need to be maximally inclusive? Or can we cut the acronym at some point? I think there's a way that we can answer these questions. How many service animals should be allowed? What is the optimal length of an acronym? Beyond just saying, who cares? We get into more consequential things like, who should be allowed to use our public library system? What sort of behaviors should we tolerate there? And what sort of behaviors are okay on public transit? How should we pass along struggling students in our schools? The way that we answer this question is not by assuming that we need to be maximally inclusive. The way that we answer it is to ask, what purpose do these institutions serve in the first place? The purpose of a school system is to educate children. It's to educate our kids, to prepare them both academically and practically for the world that they're about to enter. Passing along failing students does nothing to educate them. It doesn't help them in the long run, and frankly, it makes entire schools worse. It demoralizes teachers, and it leads some of them to leave the profession altogether. It doesn't accomplish what we want our school system to accomplish. The purpose of a library is to provide books to people. And of course, libraries have expanded over time to include other services, other functions, but they can't really accomplish the basic goals that they have set out for themselves if there are fights breaking out among homeless people inside the library, if there is open drug use with needles that children might step on. The purpose of a public transit system is to transport people safely and comfortably around a city. The purpose is not to serve as a holding pen for homeless or mentally ill people. I understand why progressive commentators have deep sympathy for the homeless. Even homeless who act badly, even people who disrupt public spaces, I understand why people are sympathetic to them. Homeless people lead very tough lives and deserve some form of help, I think. But however much sympathy we have for them, when transit authorities and policing authorities and the institutions that control our cities, when they allow unchecked antisocial behavior, it prevents public transit from doing its job for regular people. Progressive institutions, in so many cases, are just allergic to excluding anyone, to drawing boundaries for any reason, but that just doesn't work. What happens ultimately is that this excludes people anyway by the proxy of public disorder. People are going to be excluded one way or the other. And the cost of public disorder is not borne evenly across the population. It's concentrated to particular people. When public order breaks down, the most vulnerable people are the hardest hit. When crime increases, it's vulnerable communities, often communities of color, where crime is concentrated. There's a story I'd like to tell where I was knocking on doors, doing some political canvassing during the initial race, the mayor's race in New York City, when Eric Adams got elected. This would have been about 4 years ago. And there was a lot of different Democrats running. There were very progressive Democrats. There were moderate Democrats. I was up in the Bronx in basically 100% Black and Latino communities, knocking on doors for more local offices. But of course, people wanted to talk about the mayor's race as well. That was the big race in the city. And just about everyone I talked to in the Bronx, at least in this neighborhood, was pro Eric Adams. And they liked Eric Adams specifically because he was the only Democrat who was a cop, who said he was going to get crime under control. That's what they wanted. And this was in the middle, frankly, of the height of caring about Black Lives Matter, caring about police reform. And poor communities in New York City still wanted a cop, because when crime increases, it fell on their heads. Their communities were the ones that were unsafe. Their local businesses were the ones that were getting hit. Public disorder hits the vulnerable. When we think about public transit, homeless men behaving in threatening ways often impacts women the most. And there are stories of women being assaulted and killed in incidents on public transit. You think about people who can't easily avoid unsafe, hostile environments, children, the elderly, the disabled, people who, if something starts happening on their bus or their train, are not going to be able to, just athletically jump out of the way. You think about people who are, frankly, in dire financial straits, the poor who don't have an alternative that they can afford. Maybe it's easy for a rich person to just take a car, take some more expensive alternative. The poor might not be able to afford that. And frankly, over-inclusivity isn't even beneficial for the individuals that it's trying to include. Allowing unchecked antisocial behavior in the name of empathy doesn't actually help those engaging in the antisocial behavior. Not in the long run. The person urinating in the middle of a bus or smoking meth on the subway is a person in need of help. That's someone who should be taken in by the police, by the authorities, and we should try to get them the help they need. Failing to enforce standards doesn't benefit them. Failing to enforce standards in our schools doesn't benefit the students that we just pass along. Ultimately, what they need is not to pass to the next grade. It's to learn. It's to be able to read, to do math, to learn about society, science, history. These things are important, and they need our help, and they're not getting it if we're just maximally inclusive. I think sometimes we look at this on the level of the individual. We look at this on the level of the individual and in a specific moment. That in this specific moment, this minute, this second, what is the nicest, kindest thing I can do? And maybe the kindest thing you can do in a specific second is to not bother the person smoking crack on the subway, and to not interfere with them, to not disrupt their behavior. But I think we need to take a broader view, because while it might be unkind and they might resist, whatever's happening and be unhappy with us in the moment, in the longer run, it will be better for them to get help. Many of these people are in visible distress. But our institutions cannot function at the level of the individual and the second. They have to function at scale. They have to function for thousands, for millions of people over long periods of time. And we should not be allowing, exceptional cases to dictate the rules for everyone, or the system itself will begin to collapse. Again, hurting everyone involved, especially the most vulnerable. Now, sometimes people hear this kind of argument and they will critique it by saying, well, you're just blaming the vulnerable people. You're just punching down. You are blaming people with disabilities or who are homeless or who have mental illness rather than the systems that failed them. And it's true, I think, that, look, a lot of conservative rhetoric, a lot of, right-wing people who talk about this stuff really do kind of frame this issue in punitive terms. They just want to punish the homeless. They want, the homeless are gross. Let's hit them with police batons until they leave the public spaces and we never have to see them again. That's not too far from how some right-wing people think about this. But while there's a bad version of that argument, and I will not deny the bad version of the argument exists, that's not the full correct version of the argument. Certainly nothing I'm saying should absolve the government of the obligations that it has, right? If people are homeless, then we should build more housing and we should make serious attempts to get them into it. If people are mentally ill, then we should try to get them medical help. All of that remains true. I am not a conservative who wants to tear down the entirety of the welfare state. I want there to be a welfare state that can help people who are in dire need. But at the same time, we still need to enforce boundaries in public spaces. The public transit system is not a substitute for the welfare state. It is not a substitute for social policy. The boundaries that we enforce are what allow public spaces to survive while social policy catches up to help these people. And frankly, this is a uniquely American problem. If you go to other countries, other first world countries that are as rich as us, or at least somewhat as rich as us, there are very few countries that are really as rich as America, but other countries do not have this issue for the most part. I'm generalizing here. There's a lot of countries out there, but other countries don't have this. You go to Japan and Korea, they have sparkling public transit systems with virtually no disorder of any kind. You go to Europe and they don't have this for the most part. America is a uniquely high crime society in a lot of ways, and a high disorder society in a lot of ways. We are richer than most of our peers, but we also have more crime. And that's a serious problem. And frankly, we should not be tolerating it the way that we do sometimes. We should not allow public disorder. Other countries do not do this. Other countries that have generous welfare states and generous social services do not allow this kind of public mental illness, this public disruption. You can have both things. You can have a good welfare state, and you can also not tolerate this kind of disorder. Some people will critique this by asking, well, who gets to decide what is disruptive? It's true. Somebody will have to decide. And it's also true that sometimes in the past, the idea of maintaining public order has been used to exclude people. Unfairly, in some instances, exclude minorities, LGBT people, civil rights protesters. It's true that this framework that I'm proposing could be weaponized. Yes. And yet, there's a lot of things that can be weaponized. The courts can be weaponized for political reasons, but we still need to have a court system. The military, by definition, is weaponized, but we still need a military, even though it can be abused. The fact that an institution or an idea could be abused if extended too far is obvious. The solution is to just not extend it too far. The solution is not to throw the idea out entirely. The solution is to just do the idea correctly. In fact, That's what I'm arguing about inclusion itself. Inclusion is a good thing. In some cases, it's just been extended too far. And so we don't abandon the idea that inclusion can be good. We just do it correctly. We do it at the correct scale rather than extending it too far. Because let's remember, I think, why inclusion is so often seen as a virtue, why inclusivity is seen as a good thing historically. For most of human history, for the vast majority of human history, frankly, people have been arbitrarily and cruelly excluded from institutions because of their class, because of their race, their gender, their sexuality, their inborn characteristics that they can't control. And excluding someone on the basis of those things is wrong. We've spent an enormous amount of time and effort building a better world where everyone has access to basic needs and basic institutions, and everyone has a chance to succeed in society, regardless of who they are. And this is a good thing. But excluding someone for their race or their gender, that is not the same thing as asking them not to smoke meth on a subway train. We have corrected great wrongs by becoming more inclusive as a society. And there's still probably more work that we need to do here. But expanding inclusion doesn't eliminate trade-offs. Trade-offs are a function of the world that will always exist. Sometimes when you try really hard to get one particular thing, you start sacrificing some other principle in order to get it. And I believe that's what's happening in progressive spaces right now. That they are so focused on inclusion, so focused on the sin of ever excluding anyone, that they are actually causing more harm than help. That by virtue of inclusion, they end up excluding people. Inclusion should not extend infinitely. Society can't really function without empathy and compassion and caring for your fellow man. But it also can't function without boundaries. The refusal to set boundaries is not a moral virtue. Instead, refusing to set boundaries just harms the public. It harms the public, it breaks down our social spaces, it harms the vulnerable in particular, and in the end, it harms the people who it's supposedly including. This combination of compassion and boundaries at the same time is what makes a liberal, pluralistic society possible. And I think that's what we need to remember. That inclusion is a means, not an end in and of itself. Our institutions in society have goals. They have things they're trying to accomplish. And inclusion is useful when it helps them accomplish those things. But it is not a goal in and of itself. Inclusion is something that should be used to grow and sustain the things we care about, not dissolve them. So we need to be careful that in trying to maintain the moral virtue of inclusion, that we don't accidentally sacrifice the things that really matter. With that, I think we will draw the episode to a close. Thank you one more time for listening. Thank you to all our members who make the podcast possible, and we will catch you at the next episode.